if we were not there.
Woo! Greetings, everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties we had in that second video. I'm doing too much on my computer at the same time, and so it stopped playing. But hopefully you were able to hear that audio. So the first video that we just played was a snippet of a state-produced film. It was produced by the apartheid government in South Africa, bragging about how they're so good to the indigenous African people whose land they stole, talking about how they pay those African people $12 a month to work in mines, to dig up the diamonds that, such as the one that Beyonce wore for De Beers or Tiffany's or whatever this week, how they pay those Africans $12 a month to work in mines on their own land. And while these mining companies owned by European colonizers and settlers are making a profit of hundreds and millions of dollars. So that was, again, a film released by the apartheid government in South Africa, bragging about them doing this to African people on their own land. And then the second was a clip from our comrades at Anti-Conquista, a speech from Maurice Bishop, talking about how the imperialist and capitalist countries of the first world continuously exploit the nations of the global south, such as South Africa, such as Grenada, that Maurice Bishop was from. And so I wanted to have those videos playing in the beginning to set some context for the very important conversation we're going to have on the show today. But before we get into that, we want to introduce ourselves. My name is Anya Sanwu. This is my comrade, Monica. Hi, Monica. And we are we are members of the All African People's Revolutionary Party New Mexico chapter. This is our weekly program, Weekly Pan-African News. The All African People's Revolutionary Party is a revolutionary Pan-African socialist mass political party based in Africa. Our strongest and most vibrant chapters are in the African continent, but we have chapters throughout the African world, all of the United States, in Europe, in Canada, and in the Caribbean. So our political objective is Pan-Africanism. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's like military planes going over my neighborhood right now. It's very loud. Like they should calm down
a little bit.
It's really loud. It like filled the whole room for a second. I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. So we are a revolutionary Pan-African socialist political party. Also, military planes are going over my house because unfortunately the city of Albuquerque here on Tiwa territory is host to a very massive Air Force base, the Kirtland Air Force Base, and they be like flying low over residential areas on a regular basis, trying to spook people, I think. But anyway, Revolutionary Pan-African Socialist Political Party, our political objective is Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa. We are fighting for a free, unified, and socialist Africa because we believe when Africa is unified, socialist, and free, African people everywhere will be free. We'll be able to use our resources for our own well-being as a nation instead of having our resources looted and stolen by these colonizers, by these capitalists. So that's why we're out here. We started this show over a year ago at this point. It's been like almost 2 years of us doing this. Kind of wild. Also, almost 2 years of this pandemic. Damn. But we've been doing this for like a long time. We started doing the show at the beginning of the pandemic here in the United States. We realized very quickly that we could not safely gather our people for our political education events, for our community defense events in person because they were at high risk of contracting COVID-19 and suffering dire consequences thanks to underdevelopment from capitalism. And so we were like, how do we keep talking to African people and to the massive people that we're working with here in Tiwa territory without putting them at risk? Hey, let's do a show. Let's talk to them over the internet. That way we're still building, we're still learning, we're still growing, but we're keeping it safe, we're keeping it socially distanced. So that's why I've been doing weekly Pan-African News. And frequent watchers of the show will know that we always start with a couple of things. First up is the intro that I just did for y'all. I'm Monica. This is Monica. We're at New Mexico. This is our show. Second thing that we always do is that we always call in an ancestor. And the reason why we call in an ancestor is because we understand as revolutionary African people that we are part of a continuum of struggle that began the very first moment the very first colonizer set foot on the shores of Africa with the intent to loot, enslave, and steal. We understand that we are part of a struggle that has lasted for hundreds of years and that we are only here fighting today because of the people that came before us, because of the people that sacrificed so that we could be here, because of the people that laid the groundwork for us to continue this fight. Today, those people are our ancestors, and that's why we honor them, because we're here because of them. So the ancestor we want to call in today is that guy, W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois probably needs no introduction. Hopefully you are at least familiar with him thanks to works like Black Reconstruction that are actually read in U.S. schools. We are familiar with him because he appears many times on the PRP book list, starting with The World in Africa, a very comprehensive and far-reaching history of the African continent that starts thousands of years before colonialism and proves definitively that we had civilization, we had culture, we had technology, we were just chilling and being free and happy before European colonizers came. Shout out to The World in Africa. But Du Bois is a person who lived, I think, almost 100 years or over 100 years, who had many, many different lifetimes. Me and Monique were just saying he started off as, of course, one of the founding members of the NAACP. For all the contradictions of that organization, he did start it, and they were very instrumental in the fight against lynching in the United States. He then went on to become a communist once he realized that African people formed the foundation, our exploitation formed the foundation of the global capitalist system. He was like, well, clearly that's not going to free my people, so let's look at communism. Then he became a Pan-Africanist, moved to Ghana to work in the administration of Kwame Nkrumah, and spent the rest of his life, the rest of his years in Ghana, contributing to the global struggle to liberate the African continent and liberate African people. He was buried in Ghana. There is a memorial to him, like the house that he lived in while living in Ghana became a museum dedicated to his life with a mausoleum where he's buried alongside his wife. So he was a great man, a great African who dedicated his whole life and his life's work to the liberation of his people. And he was a revolutionary Pan-Africanist and a communist. We are revolutionary Pan-Africanists and we are socialists, so we absolutely uphold the contributions of W.B. Du Bois. And I also want to say very briefly to touch on the controversy that unfortunately still exists around this man. When he was alive, he had discord. It's called discord. He had conflict with Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Marcus Garvey did not care for Du Bois. Du Bois did not care for Marcus Garvey. They had some beef, y'all. They had some beef. It was real. The error that we make in the present day is looking at that history of beef that was overcome by those men and by their families and choosing to take a side, saying that if we uphold Garvey, we can't uphold Du Bois. If we uphold Du Bois, we can't uphold Garvey. But that is not true. Kwame Nkrumah, the founder of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, took the best lessons from Marcus Garvey, took the best lessons in history from W.B. Du Bois, and used those together to develop the ideology of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, to develop our organization. And so we understand perhaps better than a lot of other people that you have to take the good and leave the rest. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever that in 2021 we have to prosecute a beef between people that died like 100 years ago, y'all. It makes no sense. If both of these men made important contributions to our struggle as a people to be free, then why would we say, if y'all didn't get along, you're dead to me for life? That makes no sense. It makes no sense. We have to take the best of them, learn from their mistakes, learn from the contributions they made, and leave the rest. That beef is not ours. We don't have to carry it forward. We can uphold them both. We can recognize they both made mistakes and they both made important contributions. So I just wanted to say that just in case anyone feels any kind of way by us honoring revolutionary Pan-Africanist W.B. Du Bois, his contributions are unimpeachable, quite frankly. So
we are.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you. And to add, for the Pan-African Congress, their wives put the Pan-African Congress on together. So that beef is dismissed in all spaces, for sure.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. That's absolutely correct. Shirley Graham Du Bois and Amy Jacques Garvey worked side by side to organize the 5th Pan-African Congress. If they could get along, then how come you, not related to any of these people, 100 years later, feel the need to uphold that beef? It makes no sense. If the wives could squash it, you can too. Take the best, leave the rest. So anywho, that was the ancestors. And then the last thing that we always do in the intro of this show, every single episode, Thursdays, 12 p.m. Mountain Time, is that we acknowledge that we are on stolen land. Monique and I are speaking to y'all from Tiwa territory, also known as the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque is actually the name of a Spanish colonizer who stole this land and then slapped his stupid name on it. But this land belongs to the Tiwa Pueblo. Members of the Tiwa Pueblo are still alive. They are still fighting for their land. They are still fighting to stop extraction and stop destruction of water, land, and resources on this land by the capitalist system. This is their land. It will always be their land. They're fighting for their land back. We are fighting for our land back in Africa, just like Palestinians are fighting for their land back in occupied Palestine, just like indigenous people are fighting for their land and resources back all around the world. And so when we say land back, when we do a land acknowledgement, that is not a metaphor. That is a promise. Y'all, we are fighting for our land back, and we will get our land back just as indigenous nations all over this world will get their land back. So that is the land acknowledgement. We do it every episode, and we always make sure to make it clear that is not a metaphor. We are dead serious about getting that land back. Anywho, so before we get into the meat of the show, I just want to briefly say Haiti obviously suffered an earthquake this past weekend, or about a week ago, on August 22nd. Haiti has had a series of natural disasters that have decimated that island. They, of course, famously had an earthquake back in the Obama administration that killed many people. This past earthquake, unfortunately, killed over 2,000 people. And when things like this happen to Haiti, and they happen to Haiti a lot, we oftentimes see discourse that suggests that Haiti is cursed. I even saw African people talking about Haiti being cursed. Like, this is why they're currently constantly suffering earthquakes, epidemics, natural disasters that they can't recover from. Like, they must be cursed. And the reason why people say they're cursed is because Haiti, of course, famously started their revolution with a voodoo ceremony, and lots of colonized people believe that voodoo is some form of Satanism. And so when they practice voodoo, they bring upon punishment from the white Jesus. But that is not actually what's happening in Haiti. What's actually happening in Haiti is that this country has been punished for centuries for the so-called crime of liberating themselves from slavery, of liberating themselves from European colonialism and imperialism. In order to, after they won their Haitian Revolution, after they won the liberation of the African people on that island, European countries and the United States applied sanctions on the nation of Haiti in order to isolate them from the global economy. They forced the country of Haiti to pay back for the cost of liberating themselves, that America is going to talk about in a second. And they have spent centuries, the 18th, the 19th, the 20th, and now the 21st century, looting that country, y'all. Looting that country, extracting resources, making it so they can't build up any infrastructure to withstand these earthquakes, and basically creating a situation where, because so much is being taken from Haiti, Haiti cannot build up the basic stuff it needs to maintain itself day to day. So Haiti is not cursed. Haiti is being looted. And so understand, whenever something bad happens to Haiti, like this earthquake, it is like a meal bell for vultures all over this planet. The UN perks up its nose, the United States perks up its nose, France perks up its nose, and like, damn, can we get some more loot out of Haiti right now? And so now the United States has deployed 420 soldiers, 200 Marines, helicopters, and a platform to launch drones for aerial surveillance to Haiti. And we're told this is to help the relief effort. But if you know anything about the history of U.S. military operations in Haiti, you know that some Haitian people are going to be exploited and brutalized. We are seeing the UN raising funds, claiming to be using those funds to assist Haiti. But we already know the UN spread cholera in Haiti, killed thousands of people, and denied it. We already know that UN troops raped little girls and kids in Haiti, impregnated them, and left those kids behind. We already know the UN was an occupying military force on the island of Haiti. So why the heck is the UN raising money, claiming to use it to help Haiti? It makes no sense. It is the vultures circling this island after a catastrophe. They are seeking to pick the wound to make money for themselves while leaving Haiti even more destitute. And so we want to express our unconditional solidarity with the massive African people in Haiti that are trying to survive imperialism and colonialism, that are now being hit by the aftermath of this earthquake and these deaths that were caused by underdevelopment. We say those are our family members, that they have a right to their liberation, that the struggle for Pan-Africanism means the struggle to liberate Haiti as well, and that these vultures, the US, the UN, the core group, France, take your hands off of Haiti, leave your troops at home. Leave your troops at home. Leave these people alone and allow the masses of African people in Haiti to self-determine. You are not there to help. We already know. We've been through this before. We're not falling for it. Hands off Haiti, period. Okay, so that was a little spiel about the earthquake. And now let's move on to political education, which we have a limited amount of time for, because we have to finish the show in an hour. So let's do it. So the topic for political education on this week's show is going to be reparations. Specifically, we want to talk about who should get reparations, what reparations even are, and what should reparations look like. And the reason why we want to talk about this is because of like what's happening in Haiti, what's happening in Afghanistan, and the ongoing exploitation of our home, the African continent, by the capitalist system demands that we ask the question, if they have stolen trillions of dollars from us, if they have stolen our land, if they have stolen our resources, and we are living with the consequences of that right now, then what does redress for that theft look like? Do they just get to take trillions of dollars and walk away? Or do they have to pay us back? And what does paying us back actually mean? So that's what we're talking about today. So first and foremost, let's talk about what are reparations and why are reparations owned. Reparations are basically paying people back for exploiting them, for enslaving them in many cases, for stealing their land, for basically exploiting them and using it to build yourself up. Reparations are owed because of the process of colonization and because of the process of enslavement that saw our ancestors brought here. Reparations are owed because the colonization of the African continent, the colonization of the Western Hemisphere and parts of Southeast Asia and the Middle East all formed the economic foundation of the growth of the United States and Europe and Israel into world powers. It is very important to understand that the United States would not be a superpower today. Europe would not be a global power today if not for the fact that these people stole our land, enslaved our ancestors, committed genocide against indigenous peoples all over the world, and used the wealth they made from that process to build up their empires, to build up their capitalist system. Every time I see a picture of, like, say, like the Eiffel Tower in France, or Buckingham Palace in England, or the White House in the United States, I'm like, that is our stuff. And the reason why I say that is because these first world capitalist countries would not be the entities, the forces on the global stage they are today without stealing from us, without enslaving our ancestors, without continuing to exploit our land, labor, and resources to this day. There is no so-called first world without the exploitation of Africa and the global South. Period. Period. The narrative is always that they're like out, they're helping us, they're giving us aid, we're charity cases, white man's burden, etc., etc. That is the narrative that is spread by capitalism and colonialism, but the reality of the situation is that we are the actual funders of the charity. They are not giving charity to us. We are giving charity to them without our consent. Without our consent. The first world is the actual charity case on the global stage. So that is why reparations are owed, because these countries would not exist as superpowers without colonization, slavery, and land theft. Period. Period. Unfortunately, because the conversation about reparations is happening within the context of a capitalist and imperialist and colonial system, a white supremacist system, there's oftentimes like very narrow lanes for how that conversation can happen. And I want to talk about some examples of bad strategies for reparations that we should not seek to replicate. So first and foremost, we have here in the United States a movement that was born on the internet, but is unfortunately spreading in real life. That movement is called the ADOS, or American Descendants of Slave Movement, and it has like its own little split, because that's what we do. We do in our movements, we split them constantly. So the ADOS has its own little split, the Foundational Black Americans Movement, but they're basically seeking the same thing, which is reparations for descendants of enslaved African people in the United States, specifically only descendants of enslaved African people in the United States, to the exclusion of all other African people. So maybe you already see a problem with that based on what I just said. If the entire global economic system of capitalism is based on a foundation of profits made from enslaving African people all over the world and the colonization of Africa itself, then what kind of sense does it make to pay reparations for slavery to only a small segment of the people who were stolen from? What kind of sense does that make? But so that's one of the primary issues with ADOS and FBA, the Foundational Black American Movement, that they are seeking reparations for a very small subset of the people who are owed, and they are seeking a fraction of what's actually owed. And the reason why that's happening is because they are seeking to appeal to the United States government to cut us some checks for slavery while intentionally cutting themselves off from Africa and the rest of the African world, saying that we do not want to fight for reparations side by side with the rest of these billions of people because we feel like they're trying to get what we are owed. And so we're going to fight by ourselves, and we're going to fight for, like, you know, a smaller fraction. A smaller fraction was actually you. So ADOS and FBA tend to be pretty xenophobic. They tend to be very anti-immigrant because they push the line that African people here are coming and taking what's owed to us. African people from outside the United States are coming and taking our jobs. People, we are paid less because of these immigrants and all this kind of stuff. And also, they tend to be pro-capitalist in that they are seeking a seat at the table within the U.S. capitalist system, and they are not seeking in any way, shape, or form to threaten that system. They believe that the only way that they can get the redress they are seeking is if they work within the U.S. legal system and take the crumbs, whatever crumbs that system offers. So the shit makes no sense. It is a strategy of isolation. It is a pro-capitalist strategy of fighting for crumbs, and it's only going to, at best, win a fraction of what's actually owed for the transatlantic slave trade. Like, if we were actually paid what was owed to us for slavery and for the colonization of Africa, it would bankrupt the United States, y'all. It would bankrupt not only the United States government, but it would bankrupt many U.S. corporations like Wells Fargo, like JP Morgan Chase, like Brooks Brothers, like all of these capitalist corporations that existed during slavery that are making that profit, that are building upon that money to this day. So ADOS and FBA are narrow nationalists. They are focused on getting a small fraction of what's owed, and they are pursuing a strategy that's going to intentionally isolate them from the rest of the African world. They are putting themselves at the mercy of the U.S. government that is white supremacist, that is genocidal and imperialist. Some other examples of reparation strategies that are not going to be successful or were not successful. A man named Norman Finkelstein, who has been a frequent guest on I Mix What I Like with Dr. Jared Ball on Black Power Media, also wrote a book that I highly recommend called The Holocaust Industry. Norman Finkelstein is a Jewish man who is the son of a woman who survived the Holocaust, who received reparations from the German government as a result of her experience during that barbaric period in history. However, what Norman Finkelstein lays out in his interviews with Jared Ball and also in that book, The Holocaust Industry, is that when reparations were paid for the Holocaust, what ended up happening is that the most powerful and already wealthy foundations and organizations within the pool of people that were due reparations monopolized the majority of what was paid out. And so these like powerful Jewish organizations saw hundreds of millions of dollars or millions of dollars in reparations paid for the Holocaust, and people like Norman Finkelstein's mother, who was directly impacted by that experience, received probably a couple of $1,000s, he said. So these huge organizations that already had power within this community, that used that power to calcify class contradictions within the Jewish community, received millions of dollars. The actual survivors of the Holocaust got a few thousand. They got a few $1,000s. So this is one example that is often held up by members of ADOS and the Foundational Black American Movement to say, this group's got reparations, this group's got reparations. How come they get it and we don't? This should be anti-Africanist, blah, blah. They're talking about how Jewish people who are supposed to get all this stuff and how they got it, so we should get it too. But if you actually studied the example of how reparations were paid off for the Holocaust, what you immediately realize is that unless class contradictions within the group getting paid reparations are resolved, all that's going to happen is that the people at the top are going to take everything and the regular people are going to be left with nothing, with crumbs. This is the repeating theme in all of the history of reparations that have actually been paid out for colonialism and for imperialism, for barbaric acts under capitalism. The people at the top get the most. The people at the bottom get crumbs. The people at the top consolidate their power and use that for reactionary ends. And the people at the bottom are left voiceless. This is a recurring theme. Another example of this same thing happening is that Japanese people were famously interned in the United States. In the western half of the United States, Japanese were forced into camps because people just assumed, because the United States was at war with Japan, the Japanese people would be allied with Japan. And so that was how it was justified putting them in these camps. What is not said, so we learned about the camps in school, But what's not usually said is that when Japanese people were corralled into these concentration camps on US territory, their homes, their businesses, their land, if they own land, their assets, they were not allowed to maintain ownership of any of that. When they were put into the internment camps, their property was left behind and it was distributed to European settlers. Europeans straight up took their stuff while these Japanese people were forced to live in camps. And when they were finally released from the camps, they didn't get that stuff back, y'all. They didn't even get paid for it. And so they were able to organize and fight for reparations from the US government. Those reparations ended up looking like about $20,000 per family, a check that was cut by the US government. But if you look at what they lost, their homes, their businesses, their land, years of their lives, if you look at what they actually lost, what is $20,000? These European people came up on these Japanese folks being barbarically interned, and the Japanese people got a one-time check for $20,000. That was, again, a fraction of what they were actually owed. This is another example that ADOS and FBA use to say, how come Japanese people get reparations while Africans don't? We should not be looking for reparations that look like that. We should not be seeking reparations. There's going to be a one-time check where they're like, okay, here's your money. Never talk to me about this again. Like, that's basically what it is. We're going to give you pennies and we're going to never deal with you on this question again. They're paying us off with crumbs. This is what ADOS and FBA are seeking, and it makes no sense. It makes no sense. So those are a couple examples. Reparations for the Holocaust. People at the top got a lot. People at the bottom got very little. Japanese internment, one-time check. That was a fraction of what was actually owed to those people. And then lastly, I just want to touch upon the idea of reparations looking like individual payments. So like an individual payment for a European to an individual African or colonized person. Like people on their birthday will be like, it's my birthday, Europeans pay reparations, and they put like their Cash App. Man, I am not going to begrudge anybody that hustle. Like, if you can monetize white guilt, get your life. That's fine. But it is dangerous to call that reparations. And the reason for that is what I already laid out. What is actually owed to African and colonized peoples for the violence of imperialism and capitalism is trillions of dollars. It is more than the GDP of the United States and Europe combined. It is an unfathomable amount that is due to us as colonized people, as African people. So one European hipster cash apping you, Venmoing you $5 from some Starbucks is not reparations, y'all. It's not reparations. It is white guilt monetized. It is someone trying to be nice, I guess. It's an individual act of shame, I guess. But what it is not is reparations, because that person could buy you all the coffee that exists in the world, and it would not be enough, y'all. It would not be enough. It is not what is owed. And so all people are actually doing when they're allowing Europeans to think that sending us $10, $5 rent money is reparations, all you're doing is allowing those people to think that they can pay us off, that they can pay to cover the stain is what has been done. Eventually they're gonna be like, okay, so I gave this one African person like $5,000. I'm good, right? They're gonna think they're fine because they've been Venmoing African people or colonized people for, however many years. You are allowing people to think that they can actually pay back what is owed while this system still exists. And that is a misstep, y'all. It is a misstep. By all means, let people make it rain on your birthday. By all means, shame these Europeans into giving you money if that's what you feel like doing. But do not call it reparations, because that makes a mockery of what is actually owed, what we actually need to do to achieve this liberation, to achieve the end of the system, and to actually get paid back for what's taken from us. So please, individual people paying individual other people is not reparations. It's just not. It never has been. It never will be. You cannot pay off this debt with Venmo. It's not going to happen. So, yes, those are some bad examples of reparations. And before I pass it to Monica, I just want to talk about what reparations could actually look like if they were useful. In order to have that discussion, I want to share this speech that was given by Fidel Castro at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, Tanzania. I'll drop the link in the chat right now. It's just loading. But in this speech, Fidel Castro makes a full with his chest call for reparations, not just to Africa and African people, but to indigenous peoples and all peoples fighting colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism all around the world. He calls for reparations for climate change. He's basically like, the first world looted the entire planet, enslaved people, stole land, stole resources, kicked off this process of catastrophic climate change, and now the poor countries that were colonized are on the front lines of the end of the world, and y'all are just laughing all the way to the bank. That's not okay. In this speech, Fidel Castro says that the first world capitalist countries, that places like Europe and the United States and Israel, owe reparations for colonization and for imperialism and for capitalism, and they have a responsibility to the entire world to help poor global south countries survive climate change. So I just want to read a very quick excerpt from the speech where Fidel Castro is calling for reparations. He says, the developed countries and their consumer societies, presently responsible for the accelerated and almost unstoppable destruction of the environment, have been the main beneficiaries of the conquest and colonization of slavery, of the ruthless exploitation and the extermination of hundreds of millions of people born in the countries today that constitute the third world. The imperialist countries have also reaped the benefits of the economic order imposed on humanity after two atrocious and devastating wars for a new division of the world and its markets of the privileges granted to the United States and its allies in Bretton Woods, the IMF, and the international institutions exclusively created by and for them. And so in this speech, he's like, first world, y'all became the first world by exploiting us. And so as the world is falling down around our ears, y'all owe, y'all must pay. And so in this speech, what reparations look like to Fidel Castro, he says, end the global weapons trade, end the arms race. He calls for first world nations to pay 0.7 percentage points of their gross domestic product to developed countries, to allow them to develop, or to underdeveloped countries, to allow them to develop themselves to resist climate change. He endorses a tax proposed by Nobel Prize laureate James Tobin, where approximately $1 trillion of the United States GDP would be used for the development of global south countries and to fund the United Nations. And he calls for the end of genocide against Palestinian people and the return of their land and the return of land to all indigenous peoples around the world. So this is again Fidel Castro, being a former Cuban president, accused of being dictator in the United States, even though he was not, calling for reparations with his full chest for slavery, for colonization, for imperialism, and for capitalism. And when it comes to what those reparations will look like, he said that y'all need to come out of your pockets to allow these countries you looted to develop themselves. He's not saying cut a check to every citizen of the nation of XYZ. He's saying use that nation for use that money for the collective good to lift these countries up as a whole, not individual checks to individual people, but funding the development of colonized nations. So we're going to talk in more detail about which nations are owed reparations and why. And I'm tired of talking, so I'm going to pass it to Monique to talk about Haiti.
Thank you so much, Onyesawu. So much knowledge was shared there. Onyesawu talked about what reparations are, what they're not, also gave context to how people that were stolen and resources extracted from Africa built the entire global economy, and also shared information about Fidel Castro and what reparations actually are at a collective level. And so, and also regarding land back, that is also part of reparations, right? So that our land in Africa, like that one unified socialist Africa, that a land in Africa belongs to us, it is also returned to us. And so reparations also looks like that. Specifically for the show, I'm going to talk about Haiti. And so just talking just a little bit about the Haitian Revolution, I'm just going to add on to some of the points that Onyesawu shared in the beginning about some context. So we all, if everybody, especially Africans, need to learn about the Haitian Revolution because we are all in debt to what Haiti did. So for over 12 years, our people fought for their freedom. So they were occupied by French, and literally, this is one of the colonies that was the wealthiest colony that built the French. The French had sugar, coffee, cotton, and more. They were cruel and brutal, just like any other slaver that were enslaving our people. And Haiti was facing so many challenges. And our people had uprising before the Haitian Revolution, which was from 1791 to 1803. And over 500,000 of our people, because these are our people, were being enslaved in Haiti. And so what Haiti was able to do was to conquer two armies. They were outnumbered, outarmed, and still won. They were in the mountains. They were killing these slavers who were oppressing them, who were brutalizing them, and they won their liberation. Of course, this trash country did not recognize their independence, just because of that's how capitalism works. And so Onyesawu shared before that Haiti actually had to pay a debt to France because, and they're the only enslaved group that's ever paid a debt. They paid a debt for the land, and they paid a debt for no longer to be enslaved, right? Because they could no longer make money off of free slave labor. And so they paid off an equivalent to $21 billion. I think it was like 1947. And on top of that, what also like the when I'm thinking about reparations and the funding of giving the money to the countries for the collective, is then that country also controls what's happening in their own country. And in Haiti, even when their own independence did not control what was happening in their country because of coups that happened, that this country, Canada, and Britain was also involved in. So every time that they were electing a leader, there would be a coup. And I'll talk a little about that in a little bit. But what we see on the news, similar to Africa's poverty, which isn't real, is Haiti's poverty. But what we don't see is the extraction of resources, the cheap labor that the US empire does in Haiti. We don't see the abundance of wealth that Haiti has. So Haiti has massive wealth of gold, oil, and iridium. And what that is, it's a mineral that allows spaceships and satellites to work, right? So think about that. So, and they have an abundance of land. And in their land, it's being violently, forcibly taken, right? That they're not able to farm from. So there's abundance of these resources that are, again, continued stolen from them, very similar to Africa. So this trash country, the US empire occupied Haiti in 1915. They invaded, they looted, and they also trained police. And we know that trained police also have our militaries trained, right? So that's what happened in there. I talked about a little bit how they continuously overthrew the government. So I just learned about this part. I was like, what? Not about the continuous overthrown, but one of the leaders that was elected, literally elected by the Haitian people to govern their own country, to be controlled by Haiti, was John Bertrand Aristide. And twice was removed by this and other countries in 1991 and 2004. They literally kidnapped him and took him to another country. And what happened in 2004, under the Bush administration, they said, we want to stabilize Haiti. Again, going to what Onyesawu was saying in the beginning, it was a multi-million-dollar operation. Mustafa, and what they did was they sent anywhere between 6,000 to 12,000 troops there. And the UN was also occupied there, where they also sexually assaulted and did vicious crimes to the people, vicious crimes to children and women. They also dumped human waste in the river, causing a freaking epidemic. Like they killed almost 10 to 50,000 of our people, and over like 600,000 people were sick. And there's no even medical infrastructure to help our people. y'all, this country is trash, right? And then on top of that, earthquakes, right? So the Clinton Foundation was one of many foundations that stole and looted money, right? So the earthquakes happened, celebrities were giving, all kinds of people were giving. I remember this in 2010. And the Clinton Foundation, they raised over $30 million. There was billions given to the earthquake, and that was supposed to go to building infrastructure, hospital, jobs, um, healthcare, housing, all kinds of stuff for Haiti. Nothing happened. Zero. It didn't happen. There was like 6 houses or something built. Like nothing. Billions were stole. It was not given to the people, right? And in that earthquake, over 200,000 of our people died, right? Imagine the devastation that was happening there. There's like no infrastructure on the island because look at the billions of dollars that are being looted from this country, right? And nothing is going back in, everything is being extracted. And then we also have the deportation of Haitians, right? Haitian people are coming here because of what's going on there, and then they're being deported. You know, recent when Biden became elected, he deported more Haitians than the whole time Trump was in office. And this is just like I'm scratching off the surface of the violence, of the cruelty, of the billion trillions of dollars like stolen from Haiti, and that's why reparations are owed to them. Reparations are owed to the Haitian people for many, many reasons that I'm not even going into now. We just talked a little bit about what's going on, and it's owed to them for them to be able to build their own economy, for them to be able to build their own infrastructure, for them to be able to have their own controlled institutions that they built, that they care for. And the Haitian people want it, and they fight for it, and they're murdered and they're brutalized every day fighting for their liberation. And so what reparations look like is about the collective of the people, again iterating what Onya Sabu said, not about one individual. And the Haitian people are old, and from this country, from Canada, from Britain, from France, every European country that had their hands on Haiti, they owe reparations. I'm going to pass it to you, Onya Sabu, to talk about Afghanistan.
Cool. Thank you so much, Monica, for laying out how precisely, like, that's why it's so incorrect when people say Haiti is cursed. No, like, Haiti is only curses. Colonization, y'all. Haiti is only curses. Europe, the UN, the United Snakes, and the core group, y'all. Like, that's the curse.
I had never heard of them being cursed. I've never heard that until the show today. That is trash. It's clearly capitalism. It's clearly all the hands that are in there just stealing and extracting resources.
Absolutely. And like I said, it's like I saw, unfortunately, African people saying it, and I saw like European people saying it, and like people, like it's kind of suggested in the discourse that the United States government has about Haiti, that there's just something intrinsic about Haiti and Haitian people that is causing all this to happen. And meanwhile, like you just laid out, they're being looted by this system. So thank you so much for that. Like Monica mentioned, we want to talk about reparations for Afghanistan. And the reason why we want to do that is because we want to uplift an understanding of reparations as something that is owed for imperialism and colonization everywhere. We have to understand that not just African people are owed by the United States, but that peoples all over the world, from Afghanistan to Palestine to Vietnam to Honduras to Haiti, colonized peoples all over the world that have been forced to suffer, that have been exploited by U.S. and Western imperialism are actually owed. And if we understand the fight for reparations for colonialism and imperialism as a global struggle, then we are going to be in a much stronger place to actually win them. So that is why we want to bring Afghanistan into the conversation about reparations owed. The Biden administration so-called withdrew from Afghanistan about a week ago. It was mass chaos. For some reason, people, well, not for some reason, we know why, but people in the United States were very shocked to see the aftermath of the withdrawal be just like utter chaos and terror and devastation in Afghanistan. They were like, why, how did this happen? Why didn't we see it coming? The Biden administration was like, we don't even know. Who could have known? Like, they were just acting like it just came out of nowhere. But if you've been paying any kind of attention to what the United States has been doing in Afghanistan for 2 decades, then you were not at all surprised about how that so-called withdrawal unfolded. And I say so-called withdrawal because they keep saying they're pulling troops out while sending thousands of more troops in. Like, they sent 5,000 additional U.S. troops to protect the airport in Afghanistan. So I don't understand how it's a withdrawal. They're still sending in people in drones. But anyway, so that withdrawal happened. It was chaos. People were very surprised. But with any kind of attention paid to how the U.S. has moved in Afghanistan, it was very clear that it was going to happen. And the conversation in the aftermath of that chaos has been focused on the cost of the war in Afghanistan and the general cost of the war on terror to the United Snakes, to U.S. citizens. And the reason that's like very, I hate that framing. And the reason why I hate that framing is because when we have a lens, an understanding of imperialism that centers the empire, and we completely erase the actual nations that are being devastated by these wars, we are only seeing a fraction of the story. Afghanistan was occupied by the US government and NATO forces for 20 years. In that 20-year period, it had to suffer through drone warfare, bombings of wedding parties, of random cars, of markets, of hospitals, of schools. They had to live through the occupation of military forces from imperialist countries all over the world. They had to live under puppet governments that were stood up by the United Snakes, with the only purpose of those governments being doing the bidding of the US in that region, providing them open access to the resources and exploited labor of people in Afghanistan and throughout that part of the world. So we have to understand, while looking at that 20 years, that it's not just about how much it costs us living in the United Snakes. It's not just about the fact that the United States, once again, looks like a hot mess, looks really bad on the world stage. It's about the fact that people were living under open military occupation for 20 years, that tens of thousands of civilians, like women, kids, young boys, were killed and called terrorists after the fact. At one point, this is a statistic I'm reading, in 2013, the United States spent an average of $2 million per soldier stationed in Afghanistan. They spent a total or an average of $2 million per U.S. soldier stationed in Afghanistan. During that same period, the number of children in Afghanistan suffering from malnutrition rose 50%. So even though the narrative in the United Snakes, in the U.S. media, coming from imperialist in chief Joe Biden, is that the United Snakes was there to help the people of Afghanistan, to somehow save them from the problems that the U.S. itself created. Even though that is the lie that is being spread in the United Snakes, if we actually look on the ground in Afghanistan, we see bodies. We see bombed out buildings. We see starving children. We see families suffering in the aftermath of war crimes committed against them. And then we also see that, U.S. weapons companies, military contractors, and mercenaries made money hand over fist in the same 20-year period. People like Blackwater, people like Raytheon, entities like Blackwater and Raytheon made millions of dollars in profits off of the back of the devastation of an entire country over a lie. Because the reason why the United States said they went there in the first place was as some kind of retribution for September 11th, even though all the people directly involved in September 11th were either dead or from Saudi Arabia. So what does that tell you? It tells you that they invaded this country. They occupied this country. They bombed out and droned this country for 20 years. They destroyed the aspiration of entire generations of the population of Afghanistan and Iraq and so many other places around the world for a lie, to make money for military defense contractors. Like, that's why they do it. That's why they invade these countries. Afghanistan is also the #1 producer of opium in the world, and that happened during the U.S. occupation. Tell me how the U.S. is fighting a so-called war on drugs, where wherever you see the United Snakes, the illegal drug trade proliferates, and as people in the United States make the most money. Tell me how that works. They are destroying so many nations, not just of Afghanistan, so many nations around the world for profit, for money. They are destroying the futures of children and families for profit, for money. And then they are turning around and saying, we are doing this to help you. And so it's very important when we talk about what the United States has done in Afghanistan that we not just focus on the cost to U.S. taxpayers. Certainly it was a lot of money. Certainly that money could have been used for healthcare for people living here during a pandemic, to cover people's housing costs. They didn't have to work during COVID, for all kinds of things that money could have been used. But at the same time, we must include in the conversation the actual impact of U.S. war against colonized nations around the world, the actual impact of the war on terror on Afghanistan. Afghanistan is owed reparations by the U.S. government. You do not get to post up in someone's land for 20 years, kill them indiscriminately, demonize them on the world stage, steal millions of dollars for them, get your sociopathic mercenary ass friends rich, and then walk away being like, we tried. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. All targets of U.S. imperialism are owed reparations. We must engage. If we actually want what's owed, if we actually want that the resources that were looted from us, that the land that was stolen from us, if we actually want that shit back, then we have to unite across struggles around this entire planet to demand it. Because when we actually look at the real numbers, colonized and oppressed and victims of imperialism outnumber drastically the imperialists, outnumber drastically the capitalists. And so if we were organized and united to fight for what is owed for us, to stop the looting, to end this system that keeps the looting going, they could not actually stop us. They could not actually stop us if we were organized. And so that is why we say that we are in solidarity with the mass of people in Afghanistan, that the U.S. owes Afghanistan for its reconstruction, for that occupation, that the U.S. has no right to have any kind of say whatsoever in what kind of form of government Afghanistan now has. I'm not going to sit up here and say the Taliban are a force for good, but if the people of Afghanistan want the Taliban, the people of Afghanistan should have the goddamn Taliban. It is not up for me to say. It's not for the U.S. government to say. It's not for anyone living in an empire to say. It's for the people of Afghanistan to decide for themselves. And it's for the U.S. to pay back what was owed. It's for NATO to pay back what is owed. Period. 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 So, yes, the U.S. spent hundreds of millions of dollars, trillions of dollars over 20 years in Afghanistan, and none of that money, none of it, went to the well-being of the people of Afghanistan. It was all to facilitate the destruction and looting of that nation. The U.S. was not there to help. The U.S. was there to cause terror and devastation so they could make money off of it, period. And so the last place that we want to talk about, or the last group that we want to highlight in terms of who is owed reparations, and like I said, it is all victims of imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism, period. If we unite against those systems, as people oppressed by those systems, we are an unstoppable force. But I want to highlight a last specific group for the purposes of this conversation. And that group is, of course, African people, y'all, and our land, Africa. So if you have ever tuned into an APRP program, whether it's this show, whether it's the Forward Ever podcast, whether it's the Pamphlet podcast or a Jammu show, then you have most likely heard us talking about how Africa's exploitation forms the foundation of the global system of capitalism. And what that means is that it is African resources stolen. It is African land stolen. It is African labor exploited that forms the global economic foundation of capitalism. A few examples. For example, there is a precious mineral known as coltan that is a required component to manufacture lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries are the batteries found in rechargeable devices, modern electronic devices like cell phones, like your laptop, like your tablet if you have one. If you have a Prius or some kind of other electric car, there's a lithium-ion battery in that. If you have a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, there's a lithium-ion battery in that. Basically, anything that you have to use, a modern electronic device that you have to recharge, more than likely has a lithium-ion battery. So those things are everywhere. And when we talk about things like the Green New Deal put forth by the Democratic Party, their foundation of climate strategies like that is the switch to green energy that would feature more electric cars and more uses of those batteries. So coltan is a very, very high demand mineral. Coltan is found in very high quantities in China, and coltan is found in very high quantities in the Congo. Guess where companies like Apple, like Dell, like HP, like Microsoft, like Toyota, like Tesla, guess where they get their coltan for their batteries from? Do you think they get it from China, or do you think they get it from the Congo? If you guess the Congo, you are correct. And the reason why they get it from the Congo is because China had a whole revolution, y'all. China chased out European imperialism and colonization, engaged in a class struggle on their land, fought a revolution to build socialism, and in the process of building socialism to this day. And what that means is that China is now a world power. China is now a force in the world. And that means that if US corporations, if Western corporations want to buy resources from China, they must pay a price that is set by China. China has the clout to do that. But the Congo, on the other hand, has been colonized by European and Western colonizers for centuries at this point. It was famously colonized by King Leopold of the Belgium, who killed millions, 11 million African people in the Congo in his quest to wring every bit of profit out of that land. Ownership was then passed to Belgium. That was not any better. The Congo famously organized an independence movement, elected Patrice Lumumba as their first democratically elected president. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated by the United States, working with the UN and with Belgium, and Congo is a failed state to this day. Congo is basically run like a giant plantation for the interests of European and Western imperialism and for the interests of transnational corporations. Yes, sorry, yes, we will talk about them after. Okay, the U.S. corporations that need this resource, these transnational capitalist corporations that need this resource, most often go to the Congo to get it because the Congo has no functioning government. The Congo is basically set up for maximum looting by these corporations, and now they can get this coltan from the Congo for pennies on the dollar. It is oftentimes illegally mined by little ass kids, y'all, like kids as young as 8 to 12, and then sold, crosses the border into Rwanda, and then it's sold to these transnational corporations for pennies. And the people of the Congo, the people that actually mine the resource, see little of it. And that same story about coltan, this resource that forms the backbone of so much of modern technology, we see that same story for cocoa made to manufacture candy bars that we see in supermarkets across the world, that is harvested in plantations by children paying that are paid slave wages. We see the same situation with coffee, with rubber, with bauxite, with oil, with gold, with diamonds. So many resources are found in vast quantities in Africa. They are mined or developed using exploited African labor, and then they are stolen. They are stolen by the imperialist countries and transnational corporations of the world. And the people in Africa whose resources, land, and labor are being exploited see nothing, see not a penny of the millions, trillions of dollars in profit made from the looting of their resources. So understanding this, understanding so much of the global capitalist economic system is built on a foundation of stolen African resources, then we have to say that this system could not function without the exploitation of Africa, period. Period. The entire global economic system is built on Africa's back. Capitalism became a global economic system through the enslavement of our ancestors. We were there at the very beginning being stolen from, and we're still being stolen from now. So capitalism could not function without the exploitation of Africa and African people. The United States would not be a first world power without the exploitation of Africa and African people. Europe would not be a first world power without the exploitation of Africa and African people. Israel's number one export is diamonds. And there are no diamond mines in Israel because all of the diamonds that Israel refines are stolen from Southern Africa. Do y'all understand how we are exploited every which way by this system? How it could not function, in fact, with our exploitation? That is the reality situation. That is the reality. This system could not function without exploiting us and exploiting our home, Africa. And so understanding that the global economic system is worth like trillions of dollars and that all that money would not exist without being stolen from us, understand what is actually owed to Africa and African people. Slavery is one thing, and capitalism would not be a global system without the transatlantic slave trade. Understand that. The US would not be a superpower without slavery. Understand that. But that's only one part of it. If we actually look at the wealth generated by colonization of Africa, reparations for slavery is a small fraction of what we're actually owed, y'all. They could pay us back for slavery, and that would be quite a lot, and it would still be just a fraction of what they actually took from us, and they're continuing to take from this day. They could not afford to pay African people in Africa what is actually owed for what this system took from us. It would not exist as the global economic system without stealing from us. Period. Period. So, reparations are owed to Africa and African people, not just for slavery, not just for the initial colonization of Africa, but for the ongoing exploitation of African land, labor, and resources by the global system of capitalism, period. It could not function without stealing from Africa, and that is why we, as revolutionary Pan-Africanists, are fighting for one unified socialist Africa, because we believe instead of Apple taking our shit, let me not swear, instead of Dell taking our stuff, instead of Microsoft taking our stuff, instead of these, who's that guy, Elon Musk taking our stuff, no, instead, the masses of African people should collectively control our land, labor, and resources, period. That the wealth of our land, the wealth of our resources should be under our collective and democratic control. Also, Monica has to leave. I was talking too much.
No, you weren't talking too much at all. You were dropping knowledge. Keep going. I'm gonna be listening from my phone.
Thanks, Monica. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Cool. I also see y'all fighting in the comments with that dude, RLB9652. I'm just gonna go ahead and block them because I'm tired of you, man. So that person like came in the chat and was like, didn't African people sell themselves? Do African people have to pay reparations? And I would say, you have a very colonized conception of history, friend. And for anyone that believes that African people were somehow like the primary traders within the transatlantic slave trade, I would recommend 2 books to disabuse you of that notion. First book is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, specifically chapter 3 and 4 of that book. If you want to understand why Africans sold themselves is some nonsense, you have to understand how the system of slavery worked. And so definitely recommend chapter 3 of that book for that understanding. And then another book that you should read is Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, that we're actually just finishing in work study right now here in Tiwa territory. But in that book, Eric Williams breaks down how much profit Britain specifically actually made from the transatlantic slave trade and why. And it will again help clear up any colonized understandings of how slavery worked. Some African leaders were, of course, manipulated into selling their people. That definitely happened. But they were by far not the primary players. The European powers hold the primary responsibility for the transatlantic slave trade, regardless of whether or not they were able to manipulate a handful of African people to participate. That's it. So chapter 3 of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. If you are under the delusion that African people are somehow equally culpable for the transatlantic slave trade, it's just not true. It's just not true. Also, don't argue with these people in the comments. I'm not talking to y'all, I'm talking to RLB. So anyway, so that's Africa and African people. We are absolutely owed reparations. The total that's actually due to us for reparations would bankrupt the United States and Europe and all of these corporations that made money off of our enslavement. And that's a very important point. Hold it. And then the last group, actually, there was one more group that we wanted to talk about in terms of who is owed reparations. And again, to reiterate, we believe that all colonized and oppressed peoples, all victims of Western imperialism, are owed reparations because it is the colonization and exploitation of oppressed peoples, indigenous peoples all over this planet that made these entities into superpowers. And so we're all owed, and we're stronger if we fight together. But the last group that we want to specifically highlight is indigenous peoples of the global south. So the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, the indigenous peoples of Africa, indigenous peoples all around the planet are victims of imperialism that are owed reparations. And a very, very important framework for what reparations for indigenous peoples could look like, and I'm going to share the link in a second as soon as it loads, blah, 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 is the People's Agreement from the World People's Conference on Climate Change that was held in Cochabamba, Bolivia, I believe in 2011, so quite some time ago. And what this statement is a collective resolution put out by representatives of indigenous nations all around the world calling for first world capitalist nations who have caused catastrophic climate change to pay reparations to indigenous peoples who are currently on the front line of the consequences of catastrophic climate change. So it's a very long statement, but I want to highlight some really important things about it. First up, one of my favorite things about this statement, one of the things that is most significant to me for our understanding of what reparations should look like, is that in this People's Agreement from the World People's Conference on Climate Change, the writers call for a declaration on the rights of the earth. So they talk at length about what indigenous peoples are owed and what global south nations are owed, but they open up by talking about the rights that the planet itself should have. The rights that the planet itself should have that we must recognize as protectors of that planet. So capitalism considers the planet a resource to be exploited, something to continuously extract from until it dies. But the writers of this statement, which are again indigenous peoples from all over the world who came together at this conference to talk about how to address climate change, they are saying this Mother Earth, this planet, is a living entity that has rights that we must recognize for our survival. I love it so much. So, this is what they say, to face climate change, we must recognize Mother Earth as the source of life and forge a new system based on the principles of, and again, this is a Bill of Rights for Mother Earth. They say harmony and balance among all and with all things. They say Mother Earth has the right to complementarity, solidarity, and equality. Mother Earth has the right to collective well-being and the satisfaction of the basic necessities of all life forms on this planet, not just human beings. Mother Earth has the right to host peoples, human beings, who are in harmony with nature. Mother Earth has the right to live and to exist, the right to be respected, the right to regenerate its biocapacity and to continue its vital cycles and processes free of human alteration. So capitalism, once again, is about dominating the earth. And this Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth, from this statement, they're saying, no, like, we are not dominating the earth. We are seeking for the earth to develop in the way that it wants to, because it's a living being. The right to maintain the identity and integrity as differentiated being, self-regulated and interrelated. The right to water as the source of life. So in this statement, they are upholding the right of water to be protected as the source of life for all living things on this planet. The earth has the right to clean air. The earth has the right to comprehensive health. The earth has the right to be free of contamination and pollution, free of toxic and radioactive waste. The earth has the right to be free of all alterations or modifications of its genetic structure in a manner that threatens its integrity or vital and healthy functioning. If you're like an anti-GMO person, that was for you right there. The right to be free of alterations or modifications of its genetic structure in a manner that threatens its integrity or vital and healthy functioning. HOTEPs or FOTEPs, come join. Join this vision of reparations. And then lastly, the earth has the right to prompt and full restoration for violations to the rights acknowledged in this declaration caused by human activities. So the previous 9 things were all about the basic rights that Mother Earth should have within this vision of reparations, the right to live and exist, the right to be expected, etc. And then the last one is saying that we have the right to enforce this Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth, that we have the responsibility to make sure that if these rights of Mother Earth are not respected, that there are consequences. So then again, this is indigenous people at their own conference on climate change saying that the planet that we live on has rights as a living being. And if we begin an understanding of our relationship to this land, to the earth, that centers it as a living being, that changes everything, doesn't it? Because we can't justify extracting resources, extracting oil or minerals for batteries. We can't justify destroying water that life needs to live if we understand the earth as a living being with rights. And so I feel like this understanding of how to address climate change by centering the earth as a living being is like extremely important and potentially transformative. There's a reason why, like, whenever like the NATO countries get together to like jerk each other off and pretend they're addressing climate change, why that is headline news. Like we have to hear about it on CNN, from the front page of the New York Times, when they make these promises about reducing emissions by like a fraction of a percent, and then they don't do it and there's no consequences. We hear all about that, but when conferences like this happen, where indigenous peoples, where peoples affected by climate change are on the front lines, come together to say that we want to treat the earth as a living being with rights too, you never hear about that on CNN. You never hear about that on MSNBC. It's not in the New York Times. It's not acknowledged in mainstream media in the United States. Because our understanding of how to address climate change and the destruction of the planet in the mainstream is driven by the capitalist system. And all of these NATO powers, these G8 powers, are seeking to maintain capitalism. And so they cannot acknowledge the earth as a living being because they want to keep stealing from her. They want to keep looting her. They want to keep destroying her for money. So yeah, there's like night and day difference between the climate resolutions put forward at something like a G8 meeting and the climate resolutions put forward by indigenous peoples who understand that the responsibility we have to this planet. So again, that is the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth from the People's Agreement from the World Conference on Climate Change in Bolivia. So they open up by saying the earth is a living being and she has rights. And they continue in this statement to say, okay, so these are the rights of the planet. And now let's talk about the responsibility that developed countries have to the colonized nations and peoples of the global south. The developed nations, the first world capitalist nations, have created the crisis of catastrophic climate change thanks to the consumption patterns of those nations, thanks to the wanton environmental destruction of those nations and their militaries and their corporations. They have created the problem that we are currently suffering through, where sea levels are rising, where fires are consuming entire parts of the planet, where the air quality is going down as a respiratory infection like ravages the entire planet. These nations have destroyed the planet that we all have to share together. And unfortunately, global South nations, African nations, indigenous nations are having to suffer on the front lines of the consequences of the actions of those first world wealthy nations. And so in the statement, they say, developed countries as the main cause of climate change and assuming their historical responsibility must recognize and honor their climate debt in all of its dimensions as the basis for a just, effective, and scientific solution to climate change. In this context, we demand that developed countries do the following. I'll just read a couple of things, but it's a very comprehensive vision for reparations, what reparations should look like for climate change. They say that developed countries should restore to developing countries the atmospheric space that is occupied by their greenhouse gas emissions. This implies the decolonization of the atmosphere through the reduction and absorption of their emissions. So in this first point, they're saying that y'all have polluted the sky over our land, and we have the right to clean air. And so you owe us the cleaning of the atmosphere over our nations. You don't get to burn coal for some ungodly reason in 2021, damage the ozone layer, pollute the air quality over our territory, and then not do anything about this. They say you must restore to developing countries the atmospheric space that is occupied by your dirty ass greenhouse gas emissions. Can you tell that I love this so much? Like, it's so much. It's like, give us back our air. You have polluted our air. Fix it. Address it. Next thing they say, the developed countries must assume the costs and technology transfer needs of developing countries arising from the loss of development opportunities due to living in a restricted atmospheric space. So, the developed countries have a responsibility to assume whatever expenses the developing countries accumulate while trying to address these greenhouse gas emissions coming from the industrialized world. They also say developed countries must assume responsibility for the hundreds of millions of people that will be forced to migrate due to climate change caused by these countries and eliminate their restrictive immigration policies, offering migrants a decent life with full human rights guarantees in the developed countries. So in that statement, they are saying, y'all are making our homes unlivable with your environmental destruction. You are forcing our people to flee their homes in search of better lives. And then when they get to your borders, you are putting them into concentration camps or you are turning them away. Instead, you need to allow these climate refugees that you created into your borders, into your empires built with our stolen wealth. Like immigration, the question of immigration and empire is so trifling because the United States and Europe and Israel create conditions, and Australia create conditions that are unlivable for indigenous and colonized peoples. They are looting, extracting, destroying, exploiting. They create conditions that are unlivable that force people to flee their homes, and those people get to their doorstep and they're like, we don't want you. We would like to steal your resources, have them, but we don't want you to have any of them. It is trifling. It is trifling. And the writers of this agreement, the People's Agreement from the World Climate Conference, they understand that clearly. They're like, nope, you do not get to steal from us. You do not get to destroy our homes. You do not get to like overthrow our governments and create unlivable situations and then say we can't come and live where you are. Absolutely not. If you're going to destroy my home, then you better let me into yours. Period. Period. So they are saying, they are calling for just migration, basically. They are saying that closing borders after destroying the planet is not a right that y'all get to have. They are saying that you must treat people fleeing climate crisis with humanity. You must let them in. You can't just hoard our stolen resources and wealth, period. You will never see from a G8 conference any kind of acknowledgement that it is imperialist countries driving refugee crises that are created by climate change. You will never see them talk about that. They'll talk about carbon taxes. They'll talk about reducing emissions by like 0.04% or some bullshit. They'll talk about, all these like cosmetic, they'll talk about switching to electric cars. They'll talk about all these like cosmetic, like tweaking around the edges of the deal, so-called solutions to climate change. But they'll never talk about how does the capitalist imperialist system itself driving climate change. They'll never talk about how it's creating refugee crises all over the planet. They'll never talk about any of this. But this statement from the directly impacted people covers it all. Covers it all. And the last one I want to read, and like I said, there's many more. It is very comprehensive. It is very detailed. So we dropped the link in the chat, so please check it out to read the whole thing. But the last one I want to say is that they say in this call for reparations from the developed countries that have created climate change, they say, the focus must not only be on financial compensation, but also on restorative justice, understood as the restitution of integrity to our Mother Earth and all of its beings. So in their call for reparations, there are many places where they say, y'all's wealth came from destroying the planet, so you got to come out of pocket to make sure that we can survive what you've done. They definitely call for a redistribution of resources, but they say that it's not just about that. That the capitalist system created a situation in the modern day where we are treating the planet we need to survive as an entity that can be exploited and sold off. And they're saying that that mindset, that ideology, must be fundamentally transformed, that we must transform our relationship to the planet and living beings on this planet as part of a system of reparations for colonization and imperialism and climate change. There's a very clear understanding here that what is actually owed cannot solely be repaid with money. And that is a recurring theme, once again, throughout all of these, the stories, the narratives of who is owed reparations and who's actually gotten reparations, that we've talked about today. We saw that Jewish people got cut a check, and someone corrected me in the chat. Norman Finkelstein's mother actually got $500 as reparations for the Holocaust, which is bananas. So she got $500 as reparations for that experience. In reality, like, what is the dollar amount for the attempted genocide of an entire people? Like, how much is the check that's supposed to cover that? It makes no sense. And if you look at the aftermath of World War II and how Nazis were imported into the United States to help out the U.S. war machine, how the ideology of Nazism was birthed in European settler colonialism, you see that ideologically speaking, politically speaking, the Nazis were not defeated. They were not defeated. The United States ensured that their legacy and their politics would continue. And so understanding that and what those people went through, what is the one-time check that could be paid to make recompense for that experience? It's certainly not $500, but I don't think it's an amount that exists. It's the destruction of the system that made that possible. That's the only true reparations that can exist. It's the same situation with Japanese internment. It's the same situation with the enslavement of African people and the colonization of Africa. It's the same situation with the theft of indigenous lands and the colonization and exploitation of indigenous peoples all around the world. What is actually owed cannot solely be repaid in money. There's no dollar amount that is adequate for what was taken. The only true reparations that we can be given is the destruction of the entire capitalist and imperialist system, period. Because the looting, like the birth of this system was exploitation, and it continues to thrive day by day through our same exploitation. So understanding that, they can't cut us a one-time check for any amount to pay this back. The only reparations we should accept is the total destruction of this system alongside the redistribution of wealth from the wealthy first world countries like the United States and the nations of Europe back to the colonized and indigenous people they stole from, period. Period. Reparations for African and African people and indigenous people and colonized and oppressed peoples is the destruction of the system of capitalism, the destruction of the system of imperialism, the destruction and obliteration of the systems of white supremacy and European style colonialism, period. That's it. That's it. If you want to pay us back, tear this shit down and redistribute these stolen ass funds. Period. Period. That's it. And that is a very good, if I do say so myself, segue into the last thing that we want to talk about for this situation, or for what reparations mean. And we want to talk about what that means for our work as revolutionary Pan-Africanists, as people fighting for justice against imperialism and colonialism all over the world. So obviously, like I said, this entire global economic system is based on the exploitation of Africa. It was founded with the money they made from stealing land from indigenous people and enslaving my ancestors. That's how capitalism became the global system, and now they are continuing it by looting from Africa, looting from the entire Western Hemisphere, looting from Central and Southeast Asia. So understanding that, we must seek what is owed, and what is owed is land. What is owed is control of our labor. What is owed is control of our resources and the wealth generated from those resources. We should accept nothing less than the entirety of what is owed. And if we accept nothing less than the entirety of what is owed, then we must fight for the destruction of the capitalist system. We must fight for the destruction of the imperialist system. We must demand that these entities that became fat off the backs of our exploitation, off of stealing our land, pay back what they took. Pay it back, sis. Take all that shit they took, redistribute it to the people they colonized, period. And the only way we're going to achieve that objective is if we fight for revolution, y'all. The capitalist system is never going to pay out what it owes. Because if it paid out what it owes, that would be a wrap for capitalism. They are never willingly going to do that. And so we must organize across borders on a global basis to take what is owed, to destroy this system, to make sure they cannot continue the theft and exploitation period. Period. We must fight for revolution, because revolution is the only frame in which reparations are truly possible. Reparations, what is owed, cannot be paid without the destruction of this system, period. We must also, as African people, understand that we cannot just fight for a fraction of what was done to us. We cannot just say that we are going to focus on the fight for this one subset of African people and screw everybody else. No. Because this global system is still stealing from Africa. This global system is still enslaving African people. Our day-to-day lives in the United States are built on a foundation of stolen African resources and exploited African labor. We are taking a cut. So we do not get to turn around and say that we are going to shoulder you out and fight for crumbs from the people colonizing you. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That is trifling. That is unacceptable. We must say that an injury to an African person in Haiti, an injury to an African person in Ghana and Azania, in Honduras, in Detroit, and Tiwa territory, it's all the same. We are one people, and if you attack us on one side, you're attacking all of us. And if we are fighting for one side, we're fighting for all of us. That's it. The struggle for reparations for African people must be fought on a global level because that is the scale of the crime. That is the scale of the exploitation that's happening on a global level. It is ongoing. In order to stop it against one of us, we must stop it against all of us, period. Period. So we have to expand the scope of our understanding of reparations as African people to include our home, the African continent that's being looted by U.S. corporations and Western corporations. We have to expand the scope of our understanding of reparations to include the colonization of Africa, even if you only want to focus on the United States. When you're fighting for reparations, even if you only want to focus on the United States, you can't just look at slavery because the United States has 46 separate military bases in Africa. The United States has thousands of troops deployed in Africa. The United States is training African police officers to brutalize African people. It is propping up neocolonial puppets to allow the looting of African resources. It has assassinated and overthrown revolutionary African leaders. So even if you're solely focusing on the United States, you cannot solely focus on Africans in the United States. You have to expand your vision globally because the United States is an empire. It is an empire. And either way, when we unite across borders as African people to fight for what we're owed, we are much more likely to actually win because we outnumber them. If we say we're only going to fight as African people in the United States, and even like only a subset of African people in the United States against an empire, we're not going to win. We are not going to win. At best, they're going to cut us a check for a fraction of what's owed, like they did to the Jewish folks, like they did to Japanese folks, and then they're going to say, fuck off. That is the end result of the ADOS or FBA strategy. If you actually want a chance at getting what is owed to us, we have to fight on a global level. We have to fight for everything that we are owed, and we have to fight for the destruction of the system, period. Period. In terms of catastrophic climate change and environmental destruction, reparations are owed, not just so that the nations that are on the front lines of the consequences of climate change can actually survive what is coming thanks to the actions of the first world, but also because the level of consumption that exists in the Western world is quite frankly not compatible with ongoing life on this planet, y'all. People in the United States cannot continue to live as we are. We cannot. Our consumption patterns, these transnational corporations, and the entity, the U.S. empire as an entity, is accelerating the destruction of the planet, and the people on the front lines are Black and brown and poor as hell. So it's just not going to be workable. So the United States owes, Europe owes the developing nations of the global South resources. They owe them money to develop themselves. They owe them a complete reconfiguration of our relationship to this planet. We can no longer think of the planet as an entity that can just be taken and taken and taken from. We have to begin to think of it as a living being. And so please check out that People's Agreement from the World Conference on Climate Change for more detail about what reparations to Indigenous people and for reparations for climate change look like. Because y'all, the G8 plan, the Green New Deal, all of the UN strategies for climate change, like none of that shit's gonna cut it. It's not gonna work. But this People's Agreement from the World Conference on Climate Change put together by Indigenous nations, read it, because that is the blueprint for what we need to achieve. That is the blueprint for how we're actually going to survive. So please read it. Reparations are owed for catastrophic climate change, and reparations are owed to developing nations so they can survive. So please check that out. And then lastly, like I said, the amount of money that's owed for the consequences of climate change, for imperialism, for slavery, for colonization, the amount that's actually owed to African and oppressed peoples is more than the entire GDP of this goddamn planet, y'all. Of the capitalizations of this planet. The amount that is actually owed for what was done to us and what is still being done to us would bankrupt all of these entities that are still exploiting the planet. They're not capable of paying in funds what is actually owed to us. And so we have to understand that the only chance we have at getting some kind of payback is if we take out this system that started all of this in the first place. That system is capitalism. That system is imperialism. That system is colonialism. In order for reparations to ever have a hope of being paid in any form, we must stop capitalism as a global economic system. Capitalism is the reason why Africa is poor while the US is rich. Capitalism is the reason why indigenous people live on reservations on their own land. Capitalism is the reason why European countries went to war with each other and scapegoated a segment of the population. This is why it's happening. This system is the reason behind all of the violence. This system is the reason why the planet is dying around us. This system must fall in order for any kind of payback to be realized, period. The first and foremost objective of any fight for reparations must be the destruction of the capitalist and imperialist system, period. How can anything be paid back if the damage is ongoing, if they won't even stop? As long as capitalism exists, the looting, the exploitation, the theft, the murder, the drone bombing, all of it will continue as long as the system lives. We have to stop the bleeding, and that means stopping capitalism. So there's no strategy for reparations that cannot include a revolutionary struggle to destroy the capitalist system and build a socialist system in its place. That is a precondition for any of this happening. So yeah, that was the PE. What do you people say? Are you still arguing with people? Let me read. Jay says, burn it down. Jay says, money won't cut it. We want their demise. Absolutely. My reparations is actually, let me not. Sometimes when you want to say like outrageous things, and then I'm like, wait, I'm on the internet, on Zoom, on a corporate platform. Let me not get put on another watch list. So I'll hold my tongue. But I agree. Money won't cut it. We want their demise. Deborah says, burn it down, land back. I want my little island to be free. Absolutely. Free Puerto Rico. Absolutely. Let's see. Yeah, lots of flame emojis. Soda hashtag. What is soda? It's like something of descendants. What is soda? Someone tell me in the comments. But it's something. It's a counter to ADOS that centers Africa. I do know that. So yeah, lots of good things. Lots of good things. Y'all are feeling it. Y'all are feeling it. Jay says, I'm appreciative that y'all bring up and educate around the Holocaust at times. We know more than Jewish folks were harmed during that time. It's an important piece of history to hold as we fight for liberation together. I don't think any other non-Jewish space I have been in have held space and time for that in the way you do. Thank you. Where do we appreciate that? And like I said, like I have learned a lot from anti-Zionist Jewish people and also people like Norman Finkelstein who have called out how like the attempted genocide of Jewish people has been weaponized by the capitalist and imperialist system to carry out acts of violence against other peoples. So I feel like anti-Zionist Jewish people are a really important part of the anti-imperialist and revolutionary global struggle. So for sure. Yeah. And then KD says, if you haven't yet, join an organization fighting for the liberation of your people today. SODA stands for Solidarity of Dispersed Africans. Thank you. Cool. All right. So that was the political education. I'm glad that y'all enjoyed it, and I appreciate y'all for your comments and your thoughts. That is our position on reparations. It must be used as part of our revolutionary strategy to overthrow capitalism. If we are fighting for reparations for slavery, we must have a global scope, a global understanding of what that looks like. We must include Africa. Oh yeah, one last thing I want to say. So our ancestors were enslaved, and the profits from that form the foundation of global capitalism. The colonization of Africa and the theft of indigenous land form the foundation of global capitalism. When we talk about the impact of the slave trade, though, we tend to focus on the diaspora, on the impact on the enslaved people in the diaspora. And that's absolutely fine because millions of us were brought here. Like, that's the only reason we're here in the first place. But what we don't realize is the impact that the kidnapping of millions of people had on the African continent. Like, at the time that was happening, that was like a quarter of Africa's population. Like, can you imagine if like one in every four people you knew were just like gone? What impact that would have on the organization of your society, on your economy, on your ability to defend yourselves from invaders? So Africa was colonized. Africa had its resources taken. It's still having its resources taken, but also the kidnapping of millions of people from that land had a devastating impact on Africa's ability to defend itself. And I rarely hear people talking about that. But it's very important understanding to have when we think about what is actually owed reparations and why, is the impact the slave trade had on Africa. And the person in the comments was a really unfortunate illustration of like the focus that people tend to have, which is like blaming Africa for that happening, blaming African people for that happening. But no matter which way you look at it, Africa did not get the what's it called? Whatever way you look at it, Africa got the shit end of the stick, is what I'll say. So yeah, I just want to say that. Anywho, let's keep it moving so I can wrap this up. We want to briefly talk about what's happening here in Tiwa territory in terms of the work of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We, of course, have our Pan-African Community Garden. The summer season, the summer crops are slowly petering out. We're getting a lot of tomatoes. Our greens are coming in very well. We picked a lot of beets and a lot of turnips. The beans are coming in. We're starting to talk about fall plants. So we're going to be out there for the next couple of weekends, harvesting things, finishing, building our benches, and also putting together some garden signs for the fall crops. If you are interested in helping us out, please come through Sunday at 4 p.m. Yes, Sunday at 4 p.m. here in Tiwa territory. Meet us at the garden. So at Avenida Cesar Chavez and Arno. We're going to be, like I said, finishing the benches that our comrade Bernadette from International District Healthy Communities Coalition. She helped us build some benches. So I'm going to be finishing those benches by sanding and priming them. We're going to be finishing those signs that we painted. We're going to be harvesting some crops. And then Monica is going to lead some political education about the water source that we use in the garden, the oyas. They're actually ancient African farming technologies, so she's going to talk about that history with y'all. Also, this Sunday at noon, we are having our August Cuba Solidarity Car Caravan. We're going to be meeting at the Walmart parking lot at San Mateo and Central. We're going to have speakers from the Red Nation, from Pastors for Peace, from Pueblo Action Alliance, from the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition, talking about the necessity of solidarity with Cuba. And then we're going to cruise down Central, honking and playing music. It's very cute. It's like a very fun, cute, safe time. So please come through if you're free Sunday at noon. Walmart parking lot at San Mateo and Central. It should be a very good time. And then we also are continuing our elder care program. There was a period where I was like, oh, should we stop this like a few months ago? And then Joe Biden took care of that. Joe Biden fumbled the handling of the pandemic so bad. Now we're living through another so-called wave. Cases are rising. It doesn't feel safe to be outside anymore. So we are still going to be delivering to the elders because it is still a pandemic, y'all. So every single Saturday evening or afternoon, we deliver care packages of food and masks and reading materials to African elders here in Tiwa territory. If you know an elder that would like to take advantage of that program, especially as COVID cases are ramping up, and they might want to stay inside a little bit more, hit us up, ifitbenewmexico@gmail.com or 505-295-0008. You can text us or call us at that number. And then also on Saturday, our comrades at Millions for Prisoners New Mexico, IWalk, and Jailhouse Lawyers Speak are presenting a Black August commemoration at Roosevelt Park at 5 p.m. There will be speakers, there will be food, there will be community building, there will be representatives from organizations fighting for social justice here in Tiwa territory, talking about prisoners' resistance, talking about prison abolition. It should be a very good time. I know Monica's planning to speak, and you know she's going to kill it. You know she will. So if you're in Tiwa territory, come through Saturday at 5 p.m. Roosevelt Park for the Black August commemoration organized by Millions for Prisoners New Mexico, IWalk, and Jailhouse Lawyers. Also, I recently learned that Roosevelt Park was the site of a Chicano people's uprising. Like there was like police terrorism there, and then people were like sick of it, and like rose up and then went down Central. It was kind of amazing. I learned about that from the Chicano moratorium event that the La Raza Unida and Brown Berets organized last summer. I knew a thing. But I lived down the street from that park for like a long time, and I never knew that happened until the Chicano comrades told me. So yeah, that park is like a site of resistance, historical resistance here in the city. So anywho, that's what's happening here in Tiwa territory. Let's keep it moving on to the close. This has been Weekly Pan-African News presented to you by the New Mexico chapter of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. The All-African People's Revolutionary Party is a revolutionary Pan-African socialist political party. Our political objective is Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa. When Africa is free, African people everywhere will be free. We do this show every single Thursday at 12 p.m. Mountain Time, which means we'll be back next week. And we already have our topic picked for next week. We're so organized this time. So our topic for next week is going to be capitalism and COVID-19 part 2. If you're a long-time watcher of the show, you saw part 1 back in January. Pretty much most of the things we said would happen with this pandemic in January came to be. So we're going to revisit that conversation and talk about how this pandemic is continuing in the United States and how the Biden administration and the capitalist system in general is allowing people to die that could be saved. So if you're interested in that conversation, please tune in next Thursday, 12 p.m. Mountain Time, COVID and capitalism. Also, today is Thursday, which means there's new writing on hoodcommunist.org. Please check out all of the new pieces on the blog. Very, very good writing. 5 new pieces. Check it out. Also today at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time, the editors of Hood Communist will be joined by Jackie Lukman of Lukman Nation on the By Any Means Necessary podcast to talk about an article she recently published in Hood Communist about Afghanistan. So please join us today, 5:30 Mountain Time. And lastly, I want to say that if you have enjoyed this program, if you can hear me talking, and you are not active in an organization fighting for justice, we need you in an organization, comrade. We need you in an organization fighting for justice, fighting for reparations, fighting for the end of this capitalist system. We need you off the sidelines and in this fight. The capitalist system is the most organized enemy humanity and life on earth has ever faced. It's like the Borg. And if we want to have a hope of defeating this organized enemy, we ourselves must be organized. And that means being active in organizations fighting for justice here in Tiwa territory. We, of course, have the APRP. We have the Red Nation. We have the Hookup. We have IWW. We have DSA. We have Black Rose. We have the Red Ink Collective. Y'all, this is like a mid-sized city that is riddled with incredibly great organizations. There's Millions for Prisoners in New Mexico, Building Power for Black New Mexico Movement. Y'all, no matter what kind of politics you have, I guarantee you an organization with those politics exists. Oh, no. Oh, no. Hold on. Sorry. My Zoom closed. Hi. Okay. So I guarantee you an organization with those politics exists. And so what we need to do is find the organization that aligns with your politics, join the organization, and get active. If the organization you want to see does not exist, then build that organization. If you don't know how to build an organization, then buy a John Lewis book. Or, even better, just get 2 friends together, find a book to read together, learn together by reading collectively, and then apply the ideas you read about in real life. And boom, you have an organization. It's actually not hard to do. So please, if you're not an organization, join an organization. If the one you want to see does not exist, then build it. But either way, please be active in an organization fighting for justice, so we can win reparations, so we can defeat capitalism, so we can liberate Africa, and so we can liberate African and oppressed peoples all over this planet.
Cut is that Mau Mau.
If we win. I did it too soon. Okay, so stay tuned for a closing song and slides promo for upcoming APRP events.
Cut is that Mau Mau. That 21st century